My name is Sandra Guzman, and I'm a mother. I'm a daughter, a survivor of ancestors who are with us, and I'm the producer. I'm one of the producers on The Pieces I Am, the beautiful and inspiring documentary about the legendary writer and freedom fighter, Toni Morrison.
Hey guys, I'm Nadege Green, based here in Miami. I am a journalist, storyteller, also a mom and lover of Black people, and Toni Morrison superfan and geeking out over Sandra as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And we're just gonna jump right into the conversation. Sandra, I feel like Toni Morrison books are Bibles for me. They are references, they are therapy, they are just all the things. What was that like for you to be in her presence, right? And to be able to just talk through the beauty that we saw in that film?
Mm. I get goosebumps when you talk about her books being the Bible to you. I encountered the body of work of Toni Morrison when in 2013, I had read several of her books, but I read the entirety of her work from the first novel to the last, and then everything that she wrote after. At a time when I was lonely and also joyous, I had moved to New Hampshire, the third whitest state in the nation.
Wow.
So every time I walk out the door of this campus where I live with my husband and my family, I cause a disruption. The body I walk in, my ethnicity, my culture sticks out like a sore thumb. And so I began to read her work just as a project. A friend of mine had read all of Joan Didion's work in the order in which Joan Didion wrote them, and she told me about this reading, and I was like, that's really fascinating to read an author from beginning to end, and let me try it. And so you realize you think you want to read Toni for fun, but you're reading her for liberation.
Amen.
And so for 2 years of my life, I was in the company of her and her imaginary worlds and her truths. I was cherishing Black lives. I was understanding bits of myself in a different way. It was, the transformation that happens when you're reading someone, when you're reading the Bible, when you're reading Bibles. And so I wanted to see a documentary about her life. And at the time I was working with someone who knew her intimately. And so I approached him about documentary, about doing this because he knew her. And doing a documentary so intimate as this was, you need her full cooperation.
Right.
And so at first he was like, oh, I'm working on another project, and I kept bugging him. And once you plant that seed, you just feed it. And he was ready. Timothy Sanders was ready, and so he approached her, and she was ready to tell her story. And this was all Toni wanting to share her story with us. And so I'll tell you a story when I first met her. I was at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire. She was receiving the medal day. She was receiving the highest honor in this for this organization. And she was coming out. Peter Sellers, the great director, was wheeling her out. And I was so overcome with emotion. Now, this is a woman who had been living in my heart and my brain and my body. And I shouted to her, Toni, I love you. And she turned around and she says, but do you love my work? And I said, let me count the ways. So she was always teaching. She doesn't want the adulation. She doesn't want to be like this God. She wants you to do the work. She's she's telling you stories and you should listen. And so we got a chance to talk that day a little bit, whatever it was that I mumbled to her. But she knew I loved her. And when I said I loved her, she knew what I meant. This deep respect for her brilliance and this deep respect for the dedication to Black people everywhere.
I think, I did not have the pleasure of meeting Toni Morrison when she was with us, but I feel like I met her, right? Like when you read someone's words, like that, you just feel like they become a part, like their words become a part of you. And for me, especially as a Black writer, a Black storyteller, a Black woman in storytelling, I just love just how unapologetic she was about centering Blackness. It's like Black is the default, right? Which, especially in storytelling and writing within the American context, that is not the norm, right? Black is always other, right? It's a guest appearance. It's, the sidekick, or and it certainly isn't honored in a way that like I am present, I am centered, and I'm here. And one of the things that I always like go back to, like when Ralph Ellison wrote Invisible Man and Toni Morrison countered Invisible to Whom? And that really stuck with me because for her, the default is Black. So it's like for her, there is no invisibility here. Like I'm operating from a point of visibility. I'm here, I'm present. My people are present, and that's it, period, right? And there's always this, I don't know if you've experienced this because you're also like a journalist and you've written, for publications and things like that. But, there's always this, oh, you write about the Black community or you center Black stories. That's great. But when are you going to write about something else? Right? As if that's not enough. So Toni Morrison's work has always been for me, it's that anchor that always brings me back, especially when you're in a newsroom or pitching stories to broader entities that don't necessarily always center Blackness as default. Or when you're feeling down, Toni Morrison is always that reminder for me that invisible to whom, like our stories are valid by default. Our joy is valid. All of our complexities are valid, period, as Black people. And this explaining, I just love how she never really tried to explain why Black people, why not Black people, right? I'm a Black woman, right? And no one ever asked white reporters that or white writers that. And that was in the documentary, that part where she, no one ever asked a white person, like, why do you write about white people? But as Black folks, right, you're always asked, well, why are you focusing on Black people? Is there ever a point where you want to, broaden your horizons? And you're like, these horizons are broad, right? Like the assumption that this isn't enough. Have you seen or experienced similar in your personal work?
Oh, as you're sharing your stories, I'm thinking about all the different ways in which I was told I wasn't enough and my people aren't enough, and their stories are not worthy. And as I started my career as a reporter in New York City, and I was a police reporter, so it's a very interesting lens through which to look.
I know that life.
The city of New York. And so back then, back in the day, we would receive faxes in the shack. That's what the room was called, where all the press people who covered police were stationed. And the one glaring thing that you saw on the sheet of overnight arrests and reports were the zip codes. And there were zip codes that always got the attention of everyone. And the zip code, I'll always remember it, is 10022. I think that's it. And it's the Upper East Side. And in a 10-block area, this Upper East Side neighborhood has the income equal to about 10 South American and Central American nations and 10 African nations. And these are the people that everyone responds to if there's a crime. The Central Park jogger lived in this zip code. And so everybody responds to crimes and misdemeanors and trying to figure out in this area. And whenever I tried as a reporter to cover stories from a different lens, they were not as important. And encountering the work of Toni Morrison and also James Baldwin, and also Maya Angelou, and who else? Bell Hooks,
Yes,
uh,
bell hooks, another Bible.
Audre Lorde. Um, these books confirmed and affirmed that I was enough, that our people are enough, and not only just enough, like as you're saying, that we are the center, and that we we have stories to tell. And so I I feel in many ways that I wish I had read her sooner in the way I read her. I would have suffered less, because there's a lot of suffering and you're going against the wall and you're trying to convince people of our greatness,
Right.
of the importance of telling these stories. And I feel what she exchanged with me was this unapologetic freedom to be, to own my indigenousness, to own my Caribbeanness, to own my humanity in a way that no other author had done it, with her beautiful and exquisite lyrical language and storytelling skills.
I mean, we are right now in the midst of a global pandemic. We're in the midst of a global uprising. I mean, centered here in the US on, police violence against Black folks, Black women, Black men, Black people. We're experiencing so much. And, I remember when Toni Morrison went to meet our ancestors, we were like, a lot of us were like, ooh, this world did not deserve her, but I'm so happy she was here. And I go back a lot right now thinking about like her presence and what she would say in this moment, and how she would record these times, in a way that I feel like only Toni Morrison could. But I'm also heartened in that she left behind, a bit like a blueprint of sorts, right? For us to continue that legacy of telling our stories and telling Black stories in particular, in a way that is beauty, but also can talk about pain, can talk about joy, can talk about all of the things, and just center who we are. So I'm just curious how you're processing these times right now, like what is happening right now, especially from the lens of a storyteller.
Oof. I go through all of these different emotions all the time. This emotion of extreme uh, gratitude that I am here to live this, that I can use my skills and my voice to tell the stories that are happening from my unique lens. I am terrified every time my sons go out and to drive to a few miles away to basketball practice, because we are living in the third whitest state in America. And so as a mom, as a wife, as an auntie, it is terrifying to know that we're living in. And then I'm also heartened because I know that our ancestors have survived so much, and I am the ancestor, and I survived so much. So I'm working on a memoir, and my memoir is centered around 4 women in my indigenous family. And in the books, in the white man's books, my clan, the Ineris, they call us the Archaics.
Mm.
And we are the original guardians of the islands of like 6 islands, Jamaica and the Bahamas and Puerto Rico, and we all had our indigenous names. And when I read books about the histories of these islands and my people, we were dead. We were extinct. 13 minutes after 17 ships arrived, with guns blazing, because that's what happened. But Natish, the 17 Spanish ships arrived in my ancestral town in Guayanilla. We were the first contact when Europeans arrived. And they stole 500 of my ancestors. They stole them and they took them to Spain. And so rereading and also re-remembering and also sitting at the feet of my elders, which is what I've been doing all of my life, being trained for this, gives me a sense of strength in living these times. And knowing that what matters most is to stay in community, is to continue to organize and speak up, is to continue to write. And everybody has a role to play. Everybody. We are the storytellers, which is a most sacred gift that we have been given by our ancestors. And so during these times, I have them with me, present, always. She's always with me too. She's become part of my community of and family of ancestors. And so every day is a day to remember and to pray and to be strong and to keep telling the stories and keep remembering and sharing with the young ones. And so we're going to have victory because we have moral superiority to all of those who don't see our humanity.
You know, another thing that strikes me, especially right now, is, you know, and shout out to O Cinema for putting on, you know, this anti-racism video series, movie series, documentary series. And, you know, you see, like, if you log on to Netflix right now or Prime Video, there are now, like, as soon as you log in, like, here are some Black things you can watch. And, you know, there are all of these recommendations. I mean, the New York Times bestsellers list right now is all Black authors, unheard of, right? Because everyone is interested now to read up on, you know, the things that folks have been talking about forever. And that is great. But reading a book, watching a movie is a start, but it's not necessarily doing the work, right? The internal work, you know, to root out, you know, white supremacy, to root out like how you've internalized that, right? And how that plays out day to day. And so I sit with, you know, the power of storytelling because narratives matter, right? Oftentimes it's how we get to know each other. Stories can stick with you. And it's part of the toolbox, but it's not the entire toolbox, right? That there's work to be done. There's constant work to be done, right? That this isn't a one-off. It's not, okay, I watched the movie, I'm good now. Or I found out about Juneteenth for the first time ever in 2020. I'm okay now. And there's nothing else to see here, but actually talking about the systems. You know, when I read Beloved and, you know, Toni Morrison talks about, I mean, in a way that only I felt she could, you know, reading that book, understanding the psychological harms of enslavement, right? And how that lives through your body and how that lives through future generations, you know, like the power in that. And understanding something that, you know, folks like, I read it in my history book, that's it, you know, these happy slave stories or immigrant stories. I'm like, Black folks were not immigrants, y'all. But you know, I mean, Black, you know, enslavement is not immigration. So, but you know, reading her and seeing the power that those words can have, I certainly recognize the power of, you know, storytelling, especially right now, but also I guess I would be remiss to say that it's not enough to just read the books, right? It's not enough to just write, you know, watch the videos, that there's actual work that has to happen beyond just saying, I consume this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. It's wonderful that books are being read. It's wonderful that white people are now going into the streets and protesting with us. But the work is deeper. This construction of a country, the architecture of a country, and I would argue the world, this colonizer infrastructure of nation states took centuries to build. And so how are we going to dismantle, as Audre Lorde reminded us, the house that this colonizer, this slaver built. And books are great, and documentaries are amazing. And really thinking about what I find fascinating is that throughout my career as a journalist, I would always see stories examining the pathology of Blackness and the pathology of immigrants and the pathology of poor people. I've never really seen it examine the pathology of sadism, the pathology of white supremacy, the neurosis, really, of white supremacy. And so if the first step in this anti-racist movement is to arm yourself with all of these great books that have been written, and really, if you just reading Toni Morrison sequentially, it's 400 years of American history through the lens of Black women. That's all you really need in order to understand how incredible, resilient, poetic, strong, and loving this community is, and how despite all of the attempts to terrorize, dehumanize, exterminate, Black women are still standing strong right now in this world, leading these protests, starting. I mean, Black Lives Matter, we know, was started by three sisters, queer sisters. So we know that the books are great, but the work is much deeper. And I want to say also, Nadege, that it's really important for us who are Black women and Indigenous women and people of color, for us to do the work, because we have also been raised in this white supremacy, and there's a lot of trauma that
Sure.
we have survived, and the ancestral trauma is in the DNA memory. And so there's important work for us to do, and there's important work for white people who buy into whiteness and white supremacy to do. And I think this is a very exciting time for transformation for the world, and I am excited for what's to come and what's happening now. I'm super scared sometimes, because you know that there will be, and there have been, and there will be blood, but we have to stay strong and stand tall.
So I know we just have a few more minutes before we have to wrap up, but I just want to end on a note of just gratitude for Toni Morrison's work, for all of the Black women who've come before us, who've done the work of telling our stories, no matter what, right? Like that these stories are worthy, that they are worthy of getting down on paper. And even many of our stories are oral histories, but like all of these stories that have been passed on, whether in the written word form or the stories that are just passed on through generations and, you know, through each other. I am just so thankful for our stories, because in times like this especially, it is grounding, it is healing, it is like just what I need to escape, and what can otherwise be a world where, you know, you just feel like you just can't, right? So in the moment of like, I can't deal with this world right now, Morrison's work and the work of so many other Black authors has certainly like saved me and continue to save me over and over and over again, and center and just remind me exactly who I am, right? So I'm just thankful for storytellers, for Black storytellers in particular, and for Black women.
Ditto, ditto, ditto. I woke up today with my heart on fire, because we would be sharing this moment. and because it's Juneteenth, and because I am a a member of the Born Free generation. And I'm also, my heart is filled with a lot of gratitude for those who came before us, for Miss Morrison, who taught us to love ourselves, to cherish ourselves and our stories, and to be unapologetic in this love for the family, this love for the community, in all of its tragedy and in all of its beauty. And I'm just really thankful too. Shout out to O Cinema for the series. I I I just hope that those people who haven't seen the films, to sit with the films, and those who have seen the films to keep going, to read Toni Morrison, to really reread her. She loved us so much. There was so much love, and her brilliant mind just allowed that love to just come through in these 11 novels and more than, I don't know, a dozen nonfiction works. And so you said earlier, you asked me a question earlier, what was it like to meet Toni and to be in the presence of Toni Morrison? That was your first question. And I realized that I didn't answer it. And to be in the presence of Toni Morrison was to be in the presence of an ancestor. And in the physical presence, and now we have her in the spiritual presence, and now we have her books. So it's a good time for us to transform and imagine what freedom looks like. And that's what we're doing right now.
You know, I guess on imagining freedom is also like, what is your space? You know, everyone has like a lane, like what is the thing that you can do, whether you're an artist, a writer, you might be an attorney, you might be an educator, but like, how can you help along the path of liberation and freedom right now? And like, what is the role that you can have? So I just want to shout out, like, so I work for like a justice organization, Community Justice Project in Miami. I'm their director of community research and storytelling. And I know most of the people who are watching this are from the South Florida region. So I just urge you to find the organizations that are doing the work in your community. Some of those organizations may not be 501c3s. It might just be 10 people in your neighborhood who say, we're going to get together and we're going to work on this particular thing. It might be an organized group like Community Justice Project, like FemPower Miami, like Dream Defenders. Like this can exist in so many different ways. It might just be a collective of you and your friends who, you know, like we all have a role to play and we all can do something, you know? So I just urge folks to, whatever that looks like for you, to actually find a space and do something, you know?
And that's the lesson that Miss Morrison always taught us. Like, where is your space? She wasn't marching in the streets in the 60s, but she was publishing the works of those who were. And as storytellers, I just want to mention COVID-19 because it's devastating our communities, especially the elders. And I have a special love for elders as a member of a Black and Indigenous family. We know the connection and the importance of our elders. We revere them. And so COVID-19 has taken out 8 out of 10 people who die of COVID-19 are people who are 65 and older. And so if you are a storyteller, and even if you're not, sit with your elders, learn their stories. You know, there's an African dicho and a saying that every time an elder dies, a library is burnt to the ground.
Absolutely.
And so as a storyteller, we all can become storytellers of the elders. So sit with your elders, learn their stories, and keep them as as heirlooms for future generations.
I love that. And what a way to end. Just honor our people, honor our ancestors, and keep their stories alive. Thank you all so much for tuning in and joining us and being a part of this conversation. And I hope you all keep this conversation going.